My daughter called her stepfather Dad by accident. His reaction revealed a truth he'd hidden for 3 years. I want to start with the exact moment it happened, because I have replayed it so many times since that I could describe every detail with my eyes closed. We were in our kitchen, candles lit on a small chocolate cake, my daughter Ivy turning 7, and as we all leaned in to help her blow them out, she turned to Nathan, her eyes bright with the particular excitement only a birthday can produce, and said, "Make a wish too, Dad." The word hung in the air for less than a second before she seemed to catch it herself, her small face flickering with the mild embarrassment of a child who said something without quite meaning to. She had always called him Nathan. We had never corrected her, never pushed her, never once suggested that she owed him any particular title beyond his own name. And yet there it was, slipping out of her as naturally as breath, and I watched my husband's face do something I had never once seen in 3 years of marriage. He went completely still, his eyes filling instantly, and then, without a single word, he stood up from the table and walked out onto our back porch, closing the door quietly behind him. "Hello, my name is Meredith, and this is the story of the evening." A single accidental word cracked open a silence my husband had carried since long before I ever met him, and the truth I finally learned about a little girl named Grace, a daughter he had lost, and a promise he had made to himself that I never once knew he was keeping. This isn't a story about deception in the way we usually understand it. This is a story about grief so carefully guarded that it reshaped an entire marriage without my ever realizing it. About a man who denied himself the one word he wanted more than almost anything else in the world, because some part of him believed he had already lost his right to hear it. I think you should understand, before I describe that birthday, how Nathan came into our lives. Because I don't want you to imagine ours was a marriage built on secrecy from the very beginning. I met Nathan when Ivy was 3, 2 years after my first husband, her father, died suddenly of a heart condition none of us knew he had. Nathan and I met through mutual friends, both of us cautious, both of us carrying our own losses, and what drew me to him first was his patience, the specific, unhurried way he let Ivy warm to him entirely on her own terms, never once pushing, never once trying to rush past the natural wariness of a small girl who had already learned, far too young, that people you love can simply disappear. We married when Ivy was 4, and by the time this story begins, 3 years into our marriage, Nathan had become, in every practical and emotional sense, the steady presence of her daily life. He packed her lunches, he sat through her school plays, he learned to braid hair from watching videos late at night, so he could manage it on the mornings I had early shifts at the hospital where I worked. And yet, in all that time, he never once asked her to call him anything other than Nathan, and whenever a well-meaning relative or teacher assumed, understandably, that he was simply Dad, he corrected them gently but firmly, always careful, I realized only later, never to let the correction sound as though it cost him anything at all. I want you to hold that picture firmly in your mind, because everything that follows happened underneath it. And I need you to understand exactly how carefully constructed that particular boundary actually was. I remember, in the earliest months of dating Nathan, watching him with Ivy at a local playground, patient in a way that struck me as almost unnatural for a man with no children of his own, or so I believed at the time. He never rushed her, never seemed disappointed when she preferred to play alone rather than with him, simply remained present, available, steady, the way you might imagine a lighthouse behaves rather than a man actively pursuing anyone's affection. I remember thinking, watching him that day, that he must simply be a naturally gentle person, an assumption I never once thought to question further, never imagining that his particular brand of patience had been shaped by a devastating, specific education in exactly how fragile a child's presence in your life can turn out to be. Our wedding was small, held in my sister's backyard, and I remember Nathan's toast that evening, brief and warm, promising Ivy, directly, that he would never try to replace the father she'd lost, only to stand beside her for as long as she'd allow him to. I thought, at the time, that this promise was simply thoughtful, ordinary stepfather sensitivity. I understand now that it carried an entire second layer of meaning I had no access to. A man who had already lost the right, in his own mind, to claim a title he'd once held completely, now promising an entirely different child that he would never presume to claim it again without her full, freely given consent. I want to tell you, honestly, what I knew about Nathan's past before that birthday, because I don't want you to think I had married a complete stranger, and because I think it matters for understanding exactly how carefully constructed the omission actually was, even within the ordinary boundaries of what most new couples reasonably share about their previous relationships. I knew he had been married once before, in his late 20s, a marriage that had ended in divorce after about 6 years. He described it to me, early in our relationship, in the careful general terms people often use about a painful chapter they've made peace with, but don't particularly enjoy revisiting. They had grown apart. The marriage simply hadn't worked. They had parted amicably enough that he still exchanged a polite holiday card with his ex-wife most years. I never pressed for more detail than that, the way you don't press a partner for every specific of a former relationship once you understand, generally, the shape of what happened. What I did not know, for 3 full years of marriage, was that Nathan and his first wife, a woman named Diane, had a daughter together, a little girl named Grace. I want to tell you about the days immediately following that birthday, because I think the slow unraveling of this particular truth matters as much as its eventual full revelation. Nathan came back inside about 20 minutes after he'd stepped out to the porch, his eyes still red, apologizing to Ivy for missing the rest of her cake, laughing it off as him simply getting emotional about how big she's getting. Ivy, satisfied with that explanation the way children easily are, went back to her presents, and the evening continued on its normal course. But I watched Nathan for the rest of that night, and I recognized, even without understanding its cause, that something significant had shifted in him, some old, careful architecture finally beginning to crack. I asked him, once Ivy was asleep, what had actually happened on that porch, why a single accidental word had affected him so completely. He sat down heavily on the edge of our bed, and for a long moment he didn't answer at all, simply staring at his own hands in a way I had rarely seen from him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, and he told me only, "I need a few days, Meredith. There's something I should have told you a long time ago, and I don't know how to say it properly yet. Please just give me a few days." I remember standing in our kitchen after he left the room, staring at the abandoned birthday cake, half its candles still faintly smoking, and feeling a strange, disorienting mixture of tenderness and dread that I didn't yet have language for. Ivy, blissfully unaware of the undercurrent that had just passed through the room, was already tearing into her presence, and I remember forcing myself to smile and participate in her excitement, while some quieter, more anxious part of my mind had already begun cataloging every possible explanation for what I'd just witnessed. I want to be honest about what that request did to me, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has ever received a similarly vague, unsettling promise from someone they love. A few days. Something I should have told you a long time ago. These are not phrases that inspire calm in a wife who has just watched her steady, unflappable husband dissolve into tears over a single accidental word. I lay awake that entire night beside him, running through every possible explanation my mind could produce, each one more troubling than the last. Perhaps there had been infidelity in his first marriage that he'd never disclosed. Perhaps there was a child somewhere he'd never mentioned. A son or daughter from an even earlier relationship he'd kept hidden entirely. Perhaps, in my very worst imagining, there was something about his divorce far darker than the amicable parting he'd always described. In other words, what began as a single unexplained emotional moment became, over the following days, an entire private investigation I conducted almost entirely in my own head, because Nathan, true to his word about needing time, grew quiet and distracted in a way that felt, to my already anxious mind, like confirmation of whatever troubling story I was constructing. I want to explain why I didn't press him further during those days, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has found themselves in a similar holding pattern, weighing the ordinary human instinct to demand immediate clarity against the equally human recognition that some truths genuinely need time to be spoken well, rather than spoken quickly. 3 years of marriage had taught me that Nathan was not a man who kept secrets carelessly or cruelly, and something in the particular quality of his grief on that porch, the rawness of it, suggested pain rather than guilt. I told myself, gently, that whatever this was, it deserved the time he was asking for, even as the not knowing itself grew heavier with every passing hour. There is a particular evening, about 4 days after Ivy's birthday, that I still think about often. I came home from a late shift to find Nathan sitting alone in our living room in the dark, a small, worn photograph in his hands, and when I turned on the light, I saw him quickly, almost reflexively, slip it into the drawer of the side table beside him. I did not ask him about it that night, respecting the boundary of the time he'd requested, but I want to be honest that the image of him hiding that photograph so quickly stayed with me, deepening my worry rather than easing it. I remember calling my sister during that 4th day, unable to hold the confusion alone any longer, describing Nathan's tearful reaction, his careful request for time, the photograph I'd seen him hide away. She listened for a long while and then asked me a question I hadn't yet let myself consider directly. Did his behavior actually resemble anything like guilt, or did it look more like grief? I sat with that distinction for a long time after we hung up, replaying his face on that porch, the specific quality of his tears, and admitted, finally, that whatever I had witnessed looked far more like sorrow than shame. An observation that didn't resolve my fear entirely, but did soften its sharpest edges. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who recognizes their own version of this particular waiting. The space between, "I need to tell you something," and the actual telling is one of the loneliest places a marriage can occupy, because it asks you to hold on to trust without any of the reassurance that usually sustains it. I held on to that trust for 5 days. And I want to be honest that by the 4th day, I had nearly opened that side table drawer myself, stopping only because some old, stubborn part of me wanted him to be the one to finally show me, rather than discovering it through my own quiet trespass. I remember that 5th evening beginning ordinarily enough, dinner cleared away, Ivy already tucked in for the night, the house settling into the particular quiet of a weeknight winding down. Nathan had been unusually still all through dinner, and I recognized, watching him, the specific gathering of resolve I'd seen in him before big decisions over the years, the same careful, deliberate stillness he brought to any conversation he considered genuinely important. On the 5th evening, Nathan asked me to sit down with him at our kitchen table, the same table where Ivy had blown out her candles days earlier, and he told me he was ready. He told me that when he was 29, he and Diane had welcomed a daughter, a little girl they named Grace, born on a cold February morning that Nathan described with a specificity that told me immediately how vividly he had carried every detail of it for years. He told me about Grace's laugh, a particular, unrestrained giggle that used to make the whole house feel warmer, about her fierce insistence, from the age of 3, on wearing mismatched socks every single day because she believed, with total conviction, that matching socks were boring. He told me about the year everything changed, when Grace was 5, and a routine checkup revealed a rare, aggressive form of childhood leukemia that gave her, according to her doctors, a survival outlook that shifted, week by week, depending on how her small body responded to increasingly aggressive treatment. I sat very still at that kitchen table, listening to a version of my husband's history I had never once suspected existed, understanding, with a growing, aching clarity, exactly what kind of grief that porch had briefly, uncontrollably released. He described those 18 months in a level of detail I understood he had rarely, if ever, allowed himself to share with anyone. The specific hospital corridor he and Diane used to pace at 3 in the morning when Grace's fever spiked. The particular stuffed rabbit, worn nearly bald from handling, that Grace refused to let any nurse touch except to check its temperature alongside her own, insisting it needed the same careful attention she was receiving. The brief euphoric weeks of her first remission, when the family had allowed themselves, cautiously, to imagine an entire future again, only to have that fragile hope collapse 8 months later when routine blood work revealed the cancer's return, more aggressive than before. Nathan told me about the 18 months that followed the diagnosis, the specific, unbearable rhythm of hospital stays and brief remissions and devastating relapses. A rhythm, he said, had slowly, methodically dismantled both his marriage to Diane and his own understanding of what a father was supposed to be able to protect his child from. He told me that Grace had died 3 days after her 6th birthday, in a hospital room he could still describe down to the specific pattern of the ceiling tiles he had stared at for hours in those final days, unable to look anywhere else without breaking apart entirely. He told me about the specific months following Grace's death, before the divorce itself, when he and Diane had continued sharing a home while essentially living as strangers, each of them grieving in ways the other could no longer recognize or comfort. He said Diane had wanted to talk about Grace constantly, to keep her memory present in every conversation, while he had found himself unable to hear her name without being pulled entirely back into that hospital room. And the two of them, desperate to protect themselves from a pain neither could bear witnessing in the other, had slowly stopped speaking about her at all, which he now understood had been its own particular kind of failure, a second loss layered directly on top of the first. He and Diane had divorced 14 months after Grace's death, not out of any specific betrayal or falling out, but because, as Nathan explained it, grief that enormous sometimes simply hollows out everything it touches, leaving two people who once loved each other unable to recognize themselves, let alone each other, in the wreckage it leaves behind. He told me the amicable divorce he'd always described to me was true in its broad strokes, but that the fuller truth was that neither of them had ever found a way to be in the same room without being confronted, all over again, by the enormous specific shape of what they had lost together. I asked him, gently, why he had never told me about Grace, not once, in 3 full years of marriage, especially given how completely her memory had clearly continued to shape him, and I watched him take a long breath before answering, the way you might brace yourself before stepping into cold water you know you can't avoid any longer. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he told me something that undid me more than anything else he'd said that evening. He said that when he met me, and especially once he understood how quickly he was falling in love, not only with me but with Ivy, he had made a private, deliberate decision to keep Grace's story separate from our new life, terrified that if he spoke of her too openly, too often, it would somehow feel to Ivy, or to me, as though he were measuring her against a memory she could never compete with, comparing a living child to a lost one in ways neither of them deserved to be subjected to. He told me about the year following the divorce, moving into a small apartment alone, surrounded by boxes he never fully unpacked because unpacking them meant confronting Grace's old room, condensed now into a single labeled box he could not bring himself to open for nearly 2 years. He told me about the specific isolation of grieving a child while also navigating a divorce, how few people in his life seemed to know what to say to a man who had lost both his daughter and his marriage within the same 14 months, and how he had eventually stopped mentioning either loss altogether, simply telling new acquaintances, when his past came up at all, that he'd been married once and it hadn't worked out. A phrase technically true and entirely insufficient at once. He told me, too, about the specific fear that had shaped his careful, deliberate refusal to encourage Ivy toward calling him Dad over the previous 3 years. He said that after Grace died, he had promised himself, in the rawest days of that grief, that he would never again allow himself to fully claim that particular title unless it was given to him freely, entirely without prompting, because some deep, complicated part of him had come to believe that actively seeking it, encouraging it, would somehow dishonor the memory of the daughter who had once called him that word with an innocence he was terrified he no longer deserved to receive from anyone else. I want to tell you what this revelation did to the days of fear I had been carrying, because it was not simple relief. It was something far more complicated, a rushing collision of tenderness and grief, and a kind of retroactive understanding of every small, careful boundary Nathan had maintained throughout our entire marriage, boundaries I had never once questioned because they had always seemed, on their surface, like nothing more than ordinary stepfather restraint. He told me about the specific weight of hearing Ivy say "Dad" at that birthday table, a word he had spent 3 years quietly, desperately hoping for while simultaneously refusing to let himself actively pursue it. He said that in the single second before she caught herself, he had felt something break open in him that he hadn't realized he'd kept so carefully sealed, an old, complicated grief colliding directly with a joy he hadn't fully let himself believe he was allowed to feel. I asked him about the photograph I'd seen him hide in the side table drawer, and he retrieved it without hesitation this time. A small, worn image of a laughing little girl in mismatched socks, sitting on his shoulders at what looked like a county fair, both of them grinning at whoever was holding the camera. He told me it had been taken only 3 months before her diagnosis, one of the last photographs where neither of them yet knew what was coming, and that he kept it close, moving it from apartment to apartment over the years, precisely because it captured her exactly as he most wanted to remember her, entirely herself, entirely unafraid, before illness ever entered the picture. He told me he had almost shown it to me several times over the previous 3 years, moments when Ivy did something that reminded him, briefly and painfully, of Grace. A particular laugh, a stubborn insistence on some small preference, and each time, he said, he had talked himself out of it, worried that introducing Grace into our home too casually would somehow feel, to me, or eventually to Ivy, like an unfair comparison neither of them had asked to be part of. He told me he kept it there, in that specific drawer, not out of any act of concealment, but simply because he had never yet found the right moment, in 3 years, to introduce Grace's memory into our shared life without it feeling, to his own careful protective instincts, like an intrusion on the new family we were building together. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I believe the ending matters every bit as much as the days of confused fear that came before it. I sat with him at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished speaking, the photograph resting between us, and I found myself reaching across for his hand, the same hand that had once carried a laughing little girl on his shoulders at a county fair decades earlier. I thought about the 3 years I had unknowingly lived alongside a grief this specific and this carefully guarded, and I felt, alongside the tenderness building in me, a quiet ache for all the ordinary evenings I might have spent simply asking gentler questions about his past, rather than accepting the careful, general summary he'd always offered without ever pressing further. I did not feel, in that moment, anything close to betrayal. I felt, instead, an overwhelming tenderness for the man who had carried the entire weight of a daughter's death alone for years before I ever met him, and who had continued carrying it, largely alone, throughout our entire marriage, terrified that sharing it too fully might somehow cost him the new family he had finally, cautiously, allowed himself to build. I understood, sitting at that table, exactly why the word "dad" had cracked him open so completely. It was not simply a sweet, ordinary milestone in a stepfamily's life. It was the collision of an old, guarded grief with a joy he had never quite let himself believe he deserved to receive again. I asked him whether he wanted to tell Ivy about Grace, understanding that this decision belonged entirely to him, on whatever timeline he needed, and reassuring him that I would support whatever pace felt right, even if that meant waiting years rather than weeks. He told me he did, eventually, when she was old enough to hold the fuller shape of that story with the tenderness it deserved, but that for now, he simply wanted to sit with the fact that she had called him Dad at all, without rushing to layer anything more complicated onto that particular joy just yet. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has ever discovered that a partner's careful reserve around a particular topic was protecting a grief far larger than you'd imagined. It is tempting, in the moment of discovery, to feel a kind of retroactive resentment, to ask why you weren't trusted sooner with something this significant. I felt flickers of that resentment myself, in the days immediately following Nathan's confession. But I have come to believe that the timing of a difficult truth often matters less than the sincerity with which it's eventually offered. And Nathan's sincerity, once he finally found the words, was never once in question. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because I think they matter as much as the discovery itself. Nathan placed that photograph of Grace on our bedroom dresser, no longer hidden away, a small, quiet acknowledgement that her memory now had a visible place in our shared life, rather than a sealed one. He began, slowly, sharing small stories about her with me, not as a burden he was finally allowed to set down, but as a genuine invitation for me to know a fuller version of the man I had married, mismatched socks and all. I want to tell you about a smaller moment from those first weeks, one that has stayed with me perhaps more than any other. Nathan began, tentatively, opening that long-sealed box from Grace's old room, the one he had carried unopened through 3 different homes over 8 years. He asked if I would sit with him while he finally went through it, and I remember the specific care with which he unpacked each item. Small drawings, a collection of seashells from a beach trip, the worn stuffed rabbit that had once demanded its own thermometer readings. He held that rabbit for a long time, turning it over in his hands, and then, quietly, he asked whether I thought it would be all right to give it to Ivy, not as a replacement for anything, but simply because it seemed wrong, he said, for something so loved to sit forever in a sealed box when there was a little girl in our own home who might genuinely cherish it. I remember the evening, about a month later, when Ivy noticed the photograph on our dresser and asked, with the particular directness of a 7-year-old, who the little girl was. Nathan knelt down to her level, and with a gentleness I will never forget, told her that a long time ago, before he ever met her, he had a daughter named Grace who had gotten very sick and had to go to heaven, and that seeing Ivy's own bright, mismatched sock energy sometimes reminded him, in the best possible way, of exactly how much joy a little girl could bring into a house. He showed her the photograph then, and Ivy studied it with the particular solemn attention children bring to unfamiliar grief, tracing the outline of Grace's grinning face with one small finger before asking, quietly, whether Grace had liked mismatched socks too, an entirely coincidental question that nonetheless brought fresh tears to Nathan's eyes, a small, uncanny echo of a joy he hadn't expected to find waiting for him on the other side of that conversation. Ivy considered this with the particular seriousness children bring to enormous ideas, and then asked whether that meant Grace was like her sister in heaven. I remember Nathan's face in that moment, caught somewhere between laughter and tears, telling her yes, he supposed that was exactly right. And Ivy, satisfied entirely with that answer, went to fetch the stuffed rabbit from her own room, insisting it needed a proper spot on her shelf, where she could see it every morning, right beside the framed photograph of her own late father, a small, unprompted act of a child instinctively understanding how to hold 2 kinds of love and 2 kinds of loss in the very same room without either one crowding out the other. Nathan told her yes, in a way, and I watched something settle in both of them, an old grief and a new love finding a way, gently, to coexist in the same small kitchen where a birthday candle had first cracked everything open. I think about that birthday often now. I think about the years I spent, without realizing it, married to a man carefully managing a grief I had no idea existed. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who has ever watched a partner react strangely to something that seemed, on its surface, entirely ordinary, not every strong reaction is evidence of a wound you should fear. Sometimes it is evidence of an old, protected tenderness finally finding a safe enough moment to surface. That does not mean my own confusion during those 5 days was foolish or unearned. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters as much as the tenderness of the ending. A sudden, unexplained emotional collapse, a hidden photograph, a request for unspecified time before an explanation arrives. These are not small things, and a wife who grows worried in the face of them is not a wife failing at trust. She is a woman paying attention to her own life, and she deserves an honest answer, delivered with care, but delivered nonetheless. If I could go back, I would tell Nathan, gently, that he never needed to carry Grace's memory so entirely alone, not even in the earliest, most cautious days of our relationship. I would tell him that grief shared thoughtfully does not diminish a new family. It deepens it, giving everyone involved a fuller, more honest foundation to build upon, rather than a beautiful house constructed, unknowingly, over a room neither of us had been allowed to enter. But I would also tell myself this, and I offer it now to anyone listening who is standing, tonight, in front of their own version of an unexpected, overwhelming reaction they don't yet understand. I think, sometimes, about the version of this story I might be telling you, if I had reacted to those 5 days of confusion with suspicion instead of patience, if I had pressed Nathan too hard, too quickly, before he was ready to offer the whole truth on his own terms. I think it likely would have taken us far longer, and cost us far more, to eventually arrive at the same tender understanding we reached together at our kitchen table. I am grateful, every day since, that some steady, patient part of me chose to give him the room he asked for. Know that a loved one's sudden, intense emotion is rarely about the small, immediate moment that triggered it. It is almost always about something older, something the immediate moment simply gave permission to finally surface. Approach it with curiosity rather than alarm, and give the person the space to find their own words, in their own time. Understand that some silences are not built from dishonesty, but from an excess of protective love, a fear that sharing an old grief too soon or too completely might somehow cost the new joy a person has only just begun to trust they're allowed to have. Recognize, too, that a person's careful, deliberate boundaries within a relationship are not always about you at all, however much they might appear to be from the outside. Nathan's refusal to encourage the word dad was never a reflection of anything lacking in his love for Ivy, nor any hesitation about our own marriage. It was a private, complicated negotiation between an old grief and a fragile new hope, one that happened to live inside our home without ever fully announcing its terms to the rest of us. Remember that children often say, without any calculation at all, exactly the thing an adult has spent years too afraid to ask for directly. Ivy's accidental word cost her nothing and gave Nathan everything, precisely because it arrived without agenda, without prompting, exactly the way he had always hoped, somewhere beneath his own careful restraint that it eventually might. Give yourself, too, permission to hold both grief and gratitude at the same time, the way our own small family has had to learn to hold them since that birthday. I am grateful, every single day, for the accident that finally cracked open a truth Nathan might otherwise have carried alone for years longer than he needed to. I also grieve, quietly, the specific loneliness he endured during those 3 years, protecting a story I would have gladly helped him carry from the very beginning, had I only known it existed. Learn, too, that stepfamilies are not required to choose between honoring what came before and fully embracing what comes next. Grace's memory and Ivy's daily living presence were never in competition with each other, no matter how convincingly Nathan's grief once told him otherwise. A father's heart, it turns out, is large enough to hold both a daughter lost and a daughter gained, without either one asking the other to make room by disappearing. Consider, too, how much courage it takes to finally speak a grief you've spent years believing you needed to protect everyone else from. Nathan's fear was never selfish. It was the specific, misguided generosity of a man who had learned, the hardest way possible, that love can be taken away without warning, and who genuinely believed, however mistakenly, that silence was the safest way to protect the new love he'd been given a second chance to build. And believe, finally, that the truth behind a sudden, unexplained reaction is rarely the monster your own worried imagination builds while you wait for an explanation. Far more often, if you offer patience instead of panic, what you'll discover is not a betrayal at all, but a tenderness so old and so carefully guarded that it simply needed the right ordinary moment, a candle, a cake, a single accidental word, to finally be allowed to speak its own name. I reached out to Diane, Nathan's first wife, about 8 months after that birthday, uncertain how she would receive contact from the woman who had married her former husband, but wanting, somehow, to acknowledge the shared history that had shaped so much of our own family's foundation, without either of us ever having met. She responded warmly, telling me she was glad Nathan had found happiness again, and that she thought of Grace often, still, in ways that had softened but never disappeared entirely with time. We have exchanged occasional messages since, two women bound together by a little girl neither of us can ever fully stop thinking about. And I have come to feel a strange, unexpected gratitude toward her, understanding now exactly how much of Nathan's steady, careful love for Ivy had first been shaped in the home they built and lost together. Ivy calls Nathan Dad every day now, without a second thought, the word settling into our family as naturally as it should have been allowed to from the very beginning. We keep a small shelf now in our living room, with photographs of both girls, Grace laughing in her mismatched socks, Ivy grinning gap-toothed at her most recent birthday. Two daughters who never met each other, but who, in their own separate ways, taught the same steady, careful man exactly how much love a single heart is actually capable of holding. Every February, on what would have been Grace's birthday, the three of us bake a small cake together, mismatched socks required, a quiet family tradition built not around loss, but around the specific, enduring joy another little girl continues to bring into it every single day since. Last February, on that same small tradition, Ivy asked, unprompted, if she could write Grace a letter, the way she sometimes writes letters to her own late father on his birthday. Nathan helped her fold it carefully into a small paper boat, and the three of us walked to the creek behind our house at dusk, releasing it into the current together, watching it drift out of sight beneath the fading winter light. I remember looking over at Nathan in that moment, his face open and unguarded in a way I had rarely seen even in the months since his confession, and understanding, fully and completely, that the truth he had once been so afraid to speak had not diminished our family at all. It had simply given all three of us, finally, permission to grieve and to love in the very same breath, exactly the way I suspect most families, if we're honest with each other soon enough, eventually learn they were capable of all along. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.